Please welcome Dr. Hayden King.
Hanin Bojo, Bidwewodem, Indigenous, Magizi, and Dodem, Chimnising and Donjaba, Anishinaabe and Dao. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's sort of a surreal experience for me, to be honest with you, because I did my master's degree at Queen's University back in 2004, 2005, 2006. There's supposed to be a year on that to remind me when I was here last. It was a long time ago, but I'm bumping into professors that I had back then, and I barely made it out of the politics program and graduated with my master's degree. So it's kind of strange to be back, but I'm happy to be. And thank you for those introductions, and to Janice for opening. And really, Janice said everything in 3 minutes that I'm going to cover in 45 minutes, so I'm not even sure it's necessary for me to be standing here and talking. So when I introduce myself, I let you know my name, Bidwewodem, or he who comes speaking, my clan, Magizi, Eagle Clan, the place that I'm from, Chimnising, or Beausoleil First Nation, or Christian Island, goes by many names. It's a little island in southern Georgian Bay. We actually have 3 islands. We have Chimnising, Christian Island, Hope Island, and Charity Island, which were named by the Jesuits at the time, who shepherded my ancestors to the islands in 1830. So when we introduce ourselves as Anishinaabeg people, it's important to talk about our clan relationships, the communities that we're from. It's an introduction of obligation. Obligations to the Eagle, obligations to our communities, obligations to our treaties, to each other as Anishinaabeg people. And I wanted to start by showing you Christy Belcourt's Good Land piece that she worked on a couple years ago. It's a little bit difficult to see at the back, I think, but it graphically represents the talk that I'm going to give today. It reflects 2 competing visions of Canada, 2 competing visions of Anishinaabe-Aki, 2 competing visions of Turtle Island. Not so much a before and after, but 2 distinct ways of being in the world. So I'm going to talk about those 2 visions today, the original political relationship espoused by Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee, among others, with the Dutch, the English, and the French, and then the vision that followed it, led primarily by those European settlers. And I'm going to talk about 5 eras where these visions clashed, that the relationship fell apart, and that we tried to fix it. I think we think of reconciliation as a contemporary phenomenon, that it's something new and unique that flowed out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work about 5 years ago. But the reality is, I think that we've been here before. I think we've been here 5 times before. And there are trends, and there are lessons, and there are prescriptions that we can glean from those previous experiences that apply to our contemporary situation. And this is a contemporary discussion, but we cannot have it without context. Canadians like to say that Canada is a place of much geography and little history, but I think that that's an excuse to not look back and think critically on that history. So to situate contemporary First Nation Canadian relationships within this broader trend that I'm describing, I think it's important for us to go back a little bit. First, I want to talk about First Nation, and specifically Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee forms of diplomacy in the Great Lakes era, a diplomacy that the French and the English learned well, although either pretended that they did not, or simply forgot. And to be fair, we sort of forgot as well. But the question driving our politics, the ones animating the questions we're asking today, are very similar from Indigenous traditions or Western traditions. How can diverse people share the same territory? And we've reflected on that to a great degree as Anishinaabeg people. We tell our children about how to resolve those conflicts. One of the very first stories Anishinaabeg children hear when they're coming up, although I didn't hear it until I was a young man, is the story of the moose thief. The story goes that many, many generations ago, before there were settlers, before before there was a Canada, Anishinaabeg people lived in relative harmony with the land. But one fall, they couldn't find the deer and the moose. They searched and searched throughout the fall, and they couldn't find the hoofed creatures. And so they asked other animals. They asked the muskrat if they'd seen the deer and the moose, and the muskrat, they sort of shied away and wouldn't answer them. They asked the bear, and likewise the bear shied away, wouldn't answer them. And so the Anishinaabeg continued on this path, asking the snake and asking the insects, and none of them would answer their questions. Until finally, weeks later, they came across the deer and the moose, and they had discovered that it was the crows and the owls that had kidnapped the hoofed creatures. And so the people decided to launch a war against the crows and the owls. And the war lasted many weeks. And at the end, the people got to the deer and the moose, and they said, "Come with us, we freed you, come back to our territory, and we'll all live in harmony and be well fed." And the deer and the moose said, "No, you don't understand. We sought the crows and the owls' protection because you had forgotten your obligations to us. You weren't performing ceremony when we were sacrificing ourselves to you. You were wasting our flesh. You weren't ensuring that our homes and our territories would endure in perpetuity for our offspring and future generations." And so the people understood the lesson that the deer and the moose were telling them, and they agreed to change their behavior, and they created one of the very first treaties for the Anishinaabeg, a treaty with the land. And this was effectively an institution, a mechanism by which to reduce some of the conflict that emerged from these competing interests. The story of the moose thief and the principles of the moose thief endured into some of the agreements that the Anishinaabeg made with other peoples, other Indigenous peoples, and eventually other Europeans. This is a wampum belt. A wampum belt is a mnemonic device not dissimilar from beadwork or totem poles or birch bark scrolls that Indigenous peoples have used since time immemorial to pass on story, to codify agreements like treaties. The dish with one spoon is one of the first agreements between the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee. These two groups of people, these two confederacies, have been neighbors longer than anybody can remember. And at one point, this relationship started to break down and conflict emerged. And the conflict lasted a very long time in waves. And so the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee came together under a very simple metaphor. They created a wampum belt, and it's called the dish with one spoon. And the idea is simple but sophisticated. Basically, we have to recognize that we all live in the bowl. We all live in the dish. Even as distinct political communities, we can share the same geographic territory. As long as we abide by a few basic principles. First, there's no sharp objects at the table. There's no forks or knives with which we can stab each other. But there's a spoon that we share. But we also have an obligation to make sure that the dish never runs dry, that the bowl never runs dry. And we share that obligation together. That's the agency of the land, what's inside of the bowl. And so we have to work together to ensure that the dish never runs dry. And this is, as I said, it's simple but sophisticated. It's contrary to some of the sort of Westphalian notions of politics where distinct political communities, by and large, have to be contained by rigid territorial borders. The dish with one spoon was invoked many times throughout the relationship between the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee, and eventually non-Indigenous peoples were welcomed into the dish with one spoon as well, notably in 1701. But the first of the treaties with settlers, one of the first anyway, aside from agreements made between the Mi'kmaq and the English, was the two-row wampum. And the two-row wampum, for the Mohawks in the room, they're going to roll their eyes and say, "No, we're not going to talk about the two-row wampum again. We talk about the two-row wampum all the time." But the reason we talk about the two-row wampum is because it is such a perfect manifestation of the normative relationship between Indigenous and settlers. So when Europeans arrived, and it was the Dutch that arrived first, and the Mohawks greeted the Dutch, and they had a trade relationship, and it was clear that there was going to be a long-term relationship. And so the Haudenosaunee had to present the Dutch with the terms of their relationship. How are we going to live together as distinct people on this land? And so they presented them with the two-row wampum. And so this wampum belt depicts a river. And on that river, the path of purple beads, rather, is the Haudenosaunee canoe. And the other path of purple beads is the Dutch ship. And inside the Haudenosaunee canoe are their culture, their values, their institutions. Inside the Dutch ship are their culture, their values, their institutions, their politics, and so on. Now, neither should attempt to steer the other's vessel, nor should you step foot in the other's boat. That does not mean we're not going to have a relationship. We will have a relationship, and it will be bound by those 3 rows of white beads in the middle that symbolize peace, friendship, and respect. This is the wake of our vessels as they affect each other. And we have to come together to resolve those disputes when we do affect the other. And we always have to be thinking about the river that we travel upon as well, the land that sustains us. Now, these type of agreements dominated the early relationship between Indigenous people and Europeans, in the Great Lakes era, at least, and for a time. But as the population grew of settlers and competing colonial powers fought for Indigenous allies, as disease took a tremendous toll, wiping out between 90 and 99% of the Indigenous population in the end, power relations shifted, peace gave way to war, and a lot of war. There were the Beaver Wars, or the French and Indian Wars, the Atlantic conflict, King Philip's War, and then the 7 Years' War, emerging in the 1750s. And throughout this conflict, Indigenous people struggled to assert those perspectives, struggled to assert their politics in the face of this growing population, in the face of disease. But they did not stop fighting. Now, the 7 Years' War, as most of you know, was a conflict largely between the English and the French, a global war for colonial supremacy. And in North America, it was played out between these two colonial powers in the Great Lakes. The English won that conflict and came to terms with the French. The Indigenous people, the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg in particular, did not agree to end the conflict. As Minnie Vivana famously said, "Though you have conquered the French, you have not conquered us." And so the English recognized that they needed to come to some place of peace. They needed to come to some place where Indigenous people would not be continually waging war, a relationship defined by conflict. And so they created the Royal Proclamation in 1763 and the Treaty of Fort Niagara in 1764. And I would argue that this is the first attempt at reconciliation. So to satisfy the French, the English created that shaded area in the northeast. That would be a place where the French could practice Catholicism, that they could continue their alliances with Indigenous peoples on their own terms, where they could continue to speak the French language and pass it on, French culture. Now, for Indigenous people, the English said, King George said, that anytime we want to move west of that thick black line on the map, we'll come and consult you. We'll come and talk to you about it. We'll ask your permission. We're going to keep all those 13 colonies that we've fought for and won on the eastern coast of North America, but anytime we want to expand, we'll come and ask your permission. This would, of course, result in treaties, some of the first treaties. Now, the English, I'm not sure if I included this slide. Yeah, so the English at this point had learned the language and diplomacy of Indigenous peoples, and so a year after King George issued the proclamation, the English, William Johnson, the superintendent of Indians, had this wampum belt created. And this was a gift to the 200 leaders that gathered at Niagara when the English pitched this deal and said, we want to come back into a relationship with you, we want to reconcile and do it on good terms. And you'll notice the dish graphic in the 1764 Treaty of Fort Niagara. Like the English had learned, they understood the diplomatic language and they started to use it in their overtures to Indigenous people. Now, the first era of reconciliation, like every subsequent era that we're going to talk about, did not proceed well. It ended very poorly, in fact. Soon after the Royal Proclamation, for about 20 years, Canada, or the English, quickly becoming Canada. I think there's a strong argument to make that Canada emerged in 1763, 1764. But nonetheless, for about 20 years, they kept their word on good terms. They made small-scale treaties around the Great Lakes. Every one of these shaded sort of pastel colors is a treaty that was made post-1763, 1764. Every one of those maroon shapes is an Indian reserve. So for those 20 years, there was a relative period of peace. There was, of course, conflict. Pontiac, the great Shawnee Ottawa leader, continued to try to push the English into the sea, was nearly successful. But there was a relative calm following Pontiac's War and the creation of these pre-Confederation treaties. But around 1783, they started to be called blank treaties and started to be known as the blank treaties, because effectively the English got impatient. The Indigenous people, and the Anishinaabeg in particular, and the English were speaking different languages for what should be in a treaty. The Anishinaabeg wanted to share the land, share jurisdiction over the land. And the English wanted to create one-time transactions where they could just buy the land and say, now you can move over to this little piece of land where you can be contained and under the supervision of the Queen. So eventually the English decided to change their treaty-making techniques and approach the Anishinaabeg saying, you can have whatever you want. Do you want to continue to hunt and live on your territory? You can do that. You want to receive annuities from the English? You can do that. You want healthcare, education? We'll give that to you. Just sign this document. And so the English presented a blank document, and the First Nation leaders at the time signed the document. In some cases, it was so absurd that English leaders would cut out a signature of one Indian chief and sew it into another piece of parchment and then fill in the treaty text afterwards. And so the first era of reconciliation starts to melt away relatively quickly. Not to mention the policies that colonial Canada began enacting around 1830. The euthanasia policy, for instance, which attempted to create the reserve system and have First Nation people pay for it themselves, a place where Indigenous people could be Christianized and learning European-style agriculture. The gradual civilization acts followed quickly afterwards, breaking down Indigenous governance structures, obliterating the power of Indigenous women, and attempting First Nations people to accept Canadian citizenship. And so, again, it's very clear that that era of reconciliation quickly melted away, as I said. So, come 1870, a second attempt at reconciliation by the Canadians is undertaken. Now, in 1870, Canada is largely hanging out in the Great Lakes. What is becoming Canada? Well, I suppose 3 years now. Young Canada is hanging out largely in the Great Lakes. So 1870, we have 1867, of course, as you all know, Confederation, 4 provinces. Canada begins to look to the west and sees a vast territory that is ripe for settlement and colonization. But they still decide to abide by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So in 1850, they've created a couple of treaties, the Robinson-Huron, Robinson-Superior treaties around the shoulder of the Great Lakes. And in the 1870s, decide to embark on a national treaty-making campaign, ostensibly guided by the Royal Proclamation and writing the relationships. And in this period, in this early phase, a lot of First Nation leadership accepted this offer, especially on the plains. Cree, Blackfoot, Dakota, and Dene people welcomed a treaty. They welcomed a new relationship because the buffalo were disappearing, disease was taking a devastating toll, American traders were coming up from the north and exploiting communities, and so those leaders, those communities wanted a deal. And so the number of treaties stretched across the country from 1870 to 1920, 1923, I think. What's the date here? 1921. But again, in reconciliation era number 2, the right relationship, that reconciliation did not last long, because almost immediately, just like the blank treaties or the pre-Confederation era treaties, they began to fall apart. And it goes back to this interpretation of what a treaty should be. For First Nation leaders, and I'm talking about the Cree in Treaty Number 6, Treaty Number 8, they expected annuities. Effectively, they expected to be paid for the land that they agreed to share. They expected health care, they expected education, and in exchange, those settlers could come onto the land, they could use it, they could have land to build their homes, they could have grass to feed their cows, they could have timber to build their homes, and they could live in peace and harmony with those First Nation people. But that relationship, again, changed very quickly as the numbered treaties, as they're called, stretched across the country and began to be broken. The Canadians practiced a more transactional form of treaty making. They expected First Nations to sign an oath to the Queen to move on to reserved lands, out of the way, contained, and to surrender any title or any rights they had to the land. Complementing the breaking of the numbered treaties was also the Indian Act and residential schools. So, in fact, it's really hard to separate the creation of the numbered treaties, despite the early hope, from these very draconian policies that the federal government deployed on First Nation people in an effort to contain them, and I think some have argued, in effect, to steal their land. So the Indian Act is created. And the Indian Act did all kinds of very strange things in an effort to convince Indigenous people to assimilate and be a part of Canadian culture and institutions. It did that by restricting movement. First Nation people couldn't leave a reserve, couldn't gather in numbers larger than 3, couldn't buy or sell anything to a non-native person without a permit from an Indian agent. An Indian agent is a person that policed the reserve. Couldn't go to a dance hall, couldn't drink alcohol, couldn't smoke cigarettes, couldn't play pool, all in an effort to assimilate. And of course, the Indian Act had a number of other provisions for land theft, allowing municipalities to expropriate reserved lands, allowing provinces to do the same thing. If a First Nation reserve grew too large and was in proximity to a municipality, it would be, all the inhabitants would be moved somewhere more remote. And then, of course, residential schools compelled by law First Nation children to attend, and of course, all manner of horror ensued. And so we know that the second era of reconciliation likewise ended with conflict. Now, it's important to note that First Nations did not take all of this willingly. This was not a reciprocal relationship, of course. Indigenous people resisted these policies, whether it was the Indian Act or whether it was residential schools, for 75 years. They created political organizations against the law. Of course, the Indian Act outlawed political organizing. They created the League of Indians in 1923. Indigenous women created the Homemakers Club. They were encouraged to create Homemakers Clubs at the behest of nuns to make quilts and share recipes, but they used those opportunities to keep ceremony alive. Or mothers that broke into residential schools to steal their children back. But it was really only in 1950, the late 1940s, 1950, when that resistance started to make change at the policy level. So people like Fred Loft, the Six Nations war veteran, or Francis Pego-Magabo, these men and women went to fight in the Great War and then World War II for Canada, larger than any other demographic in Canada, in fact. Entire communities were emptied of young men and young women who thought that they were honoring their treaty obligations that they had made. They were honoring this military alliance that treaties required of Indigenous people. And then when they came back, they realized that very little had changed. The same sort of oppression, the same sort of discrimination was ongoing. And yet this time, around the 1940s and 1950s, they were able to gather allies to push for change. And so a Liberal government was elected in 1951, a government of Louis Saint Laurent. And they took a year from 1950 to 1951, mid-1950 to 1951, and they went around and they consulted all of the First Nation leaders. And now at this point, most First Nations governance structures had been turned inside out and dismantled, and there's now an elected band council system in the place of clan systems or confederacies or hereditary systems. So they went around and consulted and they asked what they want, and the first thing they said the number one thing they want is self-determination, self-government. Now, the Liberals at the time didn't agree with that request, but they did want to entertain some form of reconciliation, and so they amended the Indian Act wholesale. So all of the prohibitions on culture, all the prohibitions on movement, all the prohibitions on freedom were curtailed, and First Nations could, for the very first time, move to a city or leave the reserve. And as they did, political organizing continued to emerge. So reserves at this point, of course, are bursting at the boundaries, and so many people do move into cities. They get together, they begin to organize, and they do so in the streets. They also do so in the courts. By the time that Pierre Trudeau was elected in 1960, actually, when was Pierre Trudeau elected the first time? 68, there you go. One of the very first things that Trudeau does, not dissimilar from his son, in fact, is to create a new Indian policy. And this coincides with the civil rights movement that's unfolding. Women demanding rights, black people demanding rights, Indigenous people are alongside of it, right beside them demanding rights. And so this government, like the Louis Saint Laurent government, takes a year and they consult and they say, what can we do? How can we change this relationship? How can we get us towards a just society? And this is important because this is the first time, the 1950 to 1969 is the first time that a Canadian government for 100 years sat down and said, we're going to think deeply about our relationship with Indigenous peoples and changing it for the better instead of this continuing coercion and oppression. Commissions were created, like the Hawthorne Commission, to investigate the harm, and of course the Hawthorne Commission said the last 100 years had done more harm than good. We're paternalistic, isolationist, and so Trudeau created a new policy, and it would have 5 points. Trudeau and Chrétien, in fact, Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs in 1968, and they thought that a just society meant integration. So this moment of reconciliation, they took it and they squandered it by assuming that the best way forward was to take Native people, remove their treaty, any Aboriginal rights, any inherent rights, any connection to the land, say we're going to privatize your reserves, you're going to relate to provinces in the federal government like you relate to everyday Canadians, we're going to get rid of your treaty rights and any outstanding land claims, we're going to focus on economic development. So, predictably, First Nation leaders reacted aggressively to this policy prescription in 1969, organized around the country. It contributed to the Red Power movement that was unfolding in North America at the time. It was followed very quickly by Frank Calder taking Canada to court on behalf of the Nisga'a in British Columbia, arguing and winning, although losing on a technicality, but in principle winning. If Canada has never made a treaty, then the land effectively still belongs to First Nations, and a treaty must be made. In the same year, the James Bay Cree took Canada to court over took Quebec to court over hydroelectric development in their territory against their wishes without a treaty, and won. And then in 1980, 1981, the culmination of the Red Power movement was the Constitutional Express. During this very tumultuous time of institutional change in Canada and legal and policy change in Canada, First Nations in British Columbia in particular seized that moment. They got on a train and they traveled across the country and they demanded recognition of their rights. They demanded self-determination. They demanded a type of relationship that had existed prior to Canada, at least in principle. So 1981, 1982, the Constitutional Express goes across the country and leads to the fourth era of reconciliation, the era of Aboriginal rights. I think it's important to credit the people on the Constitutional Express and Inuit leaders like Charlie Watt, who advocated aggressively for Aboriginal rights, because they did make it in, ultimately, to the Constitution. And this began that next era of reconciliation, and Pierre Trudeau was forced to admit that perhaps you had more legal rights than we thought you did. So when Canada drafted this next constitutional source, patriated the Constitution, allowed itself to make laws without having to go to the Queen every time, they also included Section 35 in the Constitution. So this is good news that Section 35 of the Constitution exists. The bad news is that nobody actually knew what it meant. What does it mean? Well, since 1982, and really I suppose since 1987, we've been trying to figure that out. But there were a number of constitutional conferences to get specific. We're going to put Aboriginal rights into the Constitution. This is a fantastic opportunity for us to finally get the relationship right, to finally achieve reconciliation. And we want to get this Constitution done quickly, so we're not going to elucidate exactly what those rights are, but we'll have 3 constitutional conferences and we'll talk about it. And at the end of those constitutional conferences, we'll have a good idea of what constitutional rights are. And again, this is an important moment. It's the first time in the Western Hemisphere where a colonial government sat down with an Indigenous people and talked about the scope of their relationship and their obligations to each other. Ultimately, the constitutional conferences ended in, well, they were ultimately all very laughable, with provincial leaders and prime ministers, Trudeau to Mulroney, not taking seriously Indigenous demands for self-determination. And in the end, there was no resolution on what Aboriginal rights were. There was the Meech Lake Accord, which attempted to bring Quebec into the Constitution, and then the Charlottetown Accord, which attempted to elucidate Aboriginal rights. They both failed, and conflict once again emerged. And this time, conflict was extreme. There was the Oka crisis, in which Brian Mulroney sent 3,000 troops to a small community in Quebec called Oka outside of Kanesatake in what he described as quote-unquote not a peacekeeping mission, to ensure that that small town could build an extension on a golf course. It ended in it was a 9-month protracted conflict in which many people were harmed and in fact killed. We also had the Ipperwash crisis in Kettle and Stony Point, outside of Kettle and Stony Point, where again, a violent confrontation between Canadian police force and an Indigenous group trying to reclaim land ended in violence and death. Gustafson's Lake, and on and on. Now, during that period, despite some conflict still emerging in this era of reconciliation, there was an attempt to mitigate. And so Brian Mulroney in 1991 created the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, Royal Commissions, of course, are inquiries that study issues of national importance to Canadians. And so Brian Mulroney created a Royal Commission and yet another reconciliatory gesture to figure out what all the problems in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians are and prescribe solutions. 5,000 pages later, 500 recommendations later, at a cost of $20 billion, the recommendations would cost $20 billion. The Royal Commission charted that path forward. Unfortunately, the Liberal government at the time, led by Paul Martin, decided to ignore the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, decided to ignore its emphasis on Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous land rights, and instead instituted a very strict 2% cap on funding for First Nation people. So since 1996 until very recently, and some people argue that it's still in place, there's been a 2% cap on what the federal government will spend on First Nation issues. And so since population growth and inflation exceeds 2% a year, that's an annual cut. So from 1996 to the present, there's been an annual cut. Well, to the very recent present, there's been an annual cut to First Nation social issues. Not only was there the cut, not only was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples shelved, Indigenous people once again took to the street in a number of days of action throughout the 2000s. And so that fourth era of reconciliation likewise faltered. That brings us into the contemporary era of reconciliation, if I'm sketching this clearly. The legacy of those days of actions were really just a very long chain in activism, all the way back to Pontiac in 1763, where a growing public pressure from Indigenous people, from First Nations, resulted and culminated, in this case, in the Idle No More movement in 2013. Originally a response to federal legislation that focused on changing laws around fisheries and navigable waters because they run roughshod over those numbered treaties, it grew into a multidimensional, multinational protest about this very bad relationship that we have. And while it had significant discursive and symbolic impacts, the Idle No More movement did, I think most acutely on the media, it did not have substantial material consequences, though it was followed quickly by the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, this is our generation's era of reconciliation. The last of the five I've sketched here have been about reconciliation, but this one is distinct, of course, because this era of reconciliation links very closely to the activism of residential school survivors. And it's important to not gloss over that activism or gloss over their experiences, because in many ways they built on the work of Idle No More, predated the work of Idle No More, worked through Idle No More to lead us to where we are today. But their work focusing on reconciliation included a settlement for the harms perpetuated by residential schools, as well as the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself. And we can say that the TRC, especially the calls to action, have made a material impact. And I think that we can see it most clearly in universities, in fact. But those overtures and that specific type of reconciliation are part of the broader, latest reconciliatory trend that we see in Canada. And it continues on, this current era that we're in of reconciliation, with the election of Justin Trudeau and a Liberal government and a movement towards a nation-to-nation relationship. So after 10 years of a Harper government, I think most First Nations in the country were very eager to have a more hospitable, accommodating, friendly government that would speak to them. And in fact, there were many election promises made, everything from, hey, if there's development on your territory, you can veto it. Or we're going to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They used this government continues to use, originally used during the campaign and then continues to use, language like nation to nation, decolonization, and yes, reconciliation. Justin Trudeau claims that this is the most important relationship to him. But there are also changes that are happening, and all this context is leading to this, the current moment that we're in right now. So I want to take a couple minutes and talk about the changes that we see happening today. So when the federal government was elected, it moved very quickly. Justin Trudeau did, just like Pierre Trudeau did, to change the relationship with Indigenous people. And a number of initiatives were undertaken. So in June 2016, the Trudeau Liberals changed the way that self-government and land claim tables would be negotiated. They created a new group of tables that didn't have mandates. We could talk about anything. They didn't have to be long-term, 20-year, hundreds of million dollars of agreements. They could be something unique. And so those tables started to emerge, and then the Liberals also decided to use those negotiation tables to inform new legislation that would change the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians for good. And I'll get to that. So we have these consultative bodies. In February 2017, the Liberals created a cabinet committee to review all laws and policies that affect Indigenous people. This was called the Decolonizing Committee. So every time the Liberals wanted to create a new policy or a new law, that would go through the Decolonizing Committee of Liberal cabinet ministers. They would say whether or not it conformed to Aboriginal rights, and then it would make its way into the legislature. Now, we don't know what's happening in the Decolonizing Committee because, of course, it's protected by cabinet secrecy. But we do know that legislation and policy have gone through that committee. Now, again, these are changes that need to happen. This is not an explicit, well, it is an explicit critique, but this is movement. This is positive movement. So in June 2017, there was a memorandum of understanding created between Canada and the Assembly of First Nations, as well as the other national Indigenous organizations, the Inuit, the Métis, Native women. And they created an MOU to focus on specific shared goals and interests that would filter down to the rest of the country. In 2017, July 2017, Canada released its 10 principles respecting the relationship with Indigenous people. So these 10 principles would sort of be a terms of reference for Canada for how they were going to engage with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people moving forward. Now, the 10 principles did say some wonderful things, like we are going to respect First Nation self-determination, we are going to settle land claims, we are going to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we're going to have a distinctions-based approach to Indigenous state relationships. In other words, there's going to be something for First Nations, there'll be something for Métis, there'll be something for Inuit, and we're not going to conflate them all. But the 10 principles also said things like Canada reserves the right to infringe on Aboriginal rights. So we're going to infringe on we'll do it nicely, but we're still going to infringe. In August 2017, they created 2 ministries. As if one Ministry of Indian Affairs wasn't enough, they created 2 Ministries of Indian Affairs. These would be the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and the Department of Indigenous Services. And this was actually a recommendation that came from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. And the Liberals took it up to change the machinery of government to better serve Indigenous people. In December 2017, 2 new fiscal policies were created. One for self-governing First Nations under modern treaties, one for historic Indian Act bands that don't have a modern treaty, that have one of those numbered treaties or pre-Confederation treaties. Now, everybody recognizes that the fiscal relationship between First Nations and Canada has to change. I mentioned the 2% cap. There's been 150 years of caps on First Nation spending. The problem with the new fiscal relationship is that while it changes, it streamlines, it makes less reporting for First Nations, it still does not describe or discuss redistribution of wealth. So there is no indication in the changing fiscal relationship that there's going to be a change in a distribution of wealth. It could be less reporting, but still chronic underfunding. In December 2017, a National Council on Reconciliation was established to ostensibly hold Canada accountable for its policies affecting Indigenous people. That council does not seem to be working yet, but soon. In February 2018, Canada started unrolling legislation that would affect First Nations. So there was omnibus legislation introduced, now making its way through Parliament, which included Bill C-69, Bill C-68, changes yet again to the Fisheries Act, changes to the Impact Assessment Act, changes to the National Energy Board, transforming it to the Energy Regulator. And these pieces of legislation are an indication of whether this era of reconciliation is different from the previous 4. Unfortunately, it does not. In the impact assessment legislation, for instance, while they were advised, the Liberals were advised by their expert committee on impact assessment to include consent, free, prior, and informed consent, the federal government decided against that. And then winter 2018, we'll expect the rights recognition and implementation framework legislation. So all of this, all of these changes to government have been taking place over the past 3 years to fundamentally transform the relationship, to get us on the path to reconciliation. It's often overlooked, I don't know if it's overlooked or just unknown to Canadians, at how active this government is on Indigenous issues. I really don't know if you can make out the chart at the back. The resolution or the contrast may be a bit too high, but effectively, since Confederation, there have been 41 bills introduced and passed legislation affecting Indigenous people. 41. In 3 years, the federal Liberals, with a Senate bill and with a NDP private members bill, there are 16 pieces of legislation that have been passed or introduced. That represents 40% of all the legislation affecting Indigenous people being introduced by this government in the last 3 years. The scope of change is dramatic. But unfortunately, when considering the direction of those changes, we see that it's much like the earlier attempts to right the relationship. Now, this is a graphic, a chart that the Yellowhead Institute produced as part of its analysis of the rights framework in June 2007. And I'm sure you can't read the text at the back, but basically it takes Indian bands with historic treaties that are under the Indian Act and pushes them out of the Indian Act. And that's a good thing. The Indian Act still exists. We want the Indian Act gone. But the direction of policy is one where Indigenous rights continue to be restricted to the reserve, that self-government can only be expressed on these postage stamp pieces of land. Traditional territories are ignored. The original treaties, or the treaties that continue to be made in the modern sense, modern treaties, are ignored. There's a focus on better financial fitness. There's a focus on capacity building and accountability. But still, truncated jurisdiction. In fact, despite the flurry of action, despite the flurry of activity, legislation, and policy, the federal government in this latest era of reconciliation is basically taking old policy tools and old legislation, repackaging them and selling them as something new, when they are still selling the same old policies, the same old Indian policies. So over the past 6 months, this process has been unfolding for the past 3 years, and over the past 6 months, we've seen First Nation leadership respond to this negatively. First Nation leaders in Ontario have called for a hard reset of the rights recognition process. Leaders in British Columbia have said they cannot support the process if it continues as it is. Last week, the Minister of Indian Affairs, or the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, was asked to stop the process, and they argued that they were on a timeline and it could not be stopped, because of course the Liberals want to have this done before the next election, implemented before the next election, in fact. Now, I can't say what will happen between now and next October, but if the trend that I have sketched in the most terse and general ways holds, we can expect it to end in conflict and reconciliation era, or the beginning of reconciliation era number 6 to begin. And here's where all the contextualization comes to bear, because we have to consider the new efforts against the last, and for me that trend is clear. In each of the examples we see the following: a period of conflict that leads to attempted resolution. The resolution period often lasts a decade, sometimes 15, sometimes 20 years, and culminates in a new policy. At the end of every one of these reconciliation periods, there's a new policy that's introduced to change the relationship. Each time, that policy or law is rejected by First Nations and the cycle starts anew. But more, we see reconciliation efforts coalesce around the notion of rights, rights being bestowed, rights being granted, and an appropriation of First Nation language and diplomacy to sell those watered-down rights. Last year at this lecture, Deborah Thompson gave an insightful talk on race and politics. And she asked, why haven't the changes that we see in Aboriginal policy resulting in racial equality in Canada? She answered that question by claiming those policies come from a place of whiteness. They come from a particular space and time, intellectual tradition that serves really to benefit white people. And so the policies take the shape of integrating difference, casting Black or Indigenous people as somehow different that need to be integrated. But I would argue, I agree with Thompson, but I argue that this inertia is the result or within a settler colonial framework. So whiteness, yes. The politics of difference, yes. Those are technologies enabled by settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is a field of study, an approach to the relationship between Canadians and Indigenous peoples that has been around for a very long time. The Cayuga leader, Descahe, or Levi generally, effectively articulated a theory of settler colonialism in 1923, although Patrick Wolfe gets credit for it in 2006. In traditional theories of colonialism, a colonial power, a foreign invader comes to new lands inhabited by Indigenous people, exploits the land, puts those people to work extracting resources and labor to send back to the colonial power, the colonial center. And then when the resources are exhausted or the colonial power is physically removed or kicked out, then they leave. And there's a period of decolonization. And of course, there's argument about whether or not decolonization in those instances ever actually took place. But settler colonialism is different because settlers don't leave. In places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the settlers endure. And this explains, at least partially, why there's no real change, because the drive of settler colonialism is to remove Indigenous people from the land, liquidate their political difference institutions, and replace them with settler institutions, appropriating Indigenous symbols and iconography along the way to distinguish themselves from their mother country. Canada sort of does this. There's still a lot of clear links between Canada and England, Britain, but there's also increasingly an adoption of Indigenous symbols and icons. So there's no real interest, a settler colonial theory would purport, in wealth or power redistribution. And Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang argue that reconciliation, the concept of reconciliation, is part and parcel of settler colonialism, in the sense that reconciliatory efforts are really only designed to rescue colonialism. I believe that the trend described here reflects that. A superficial co-opting of Indigenous demands into an articulation that changes nothing fundamental about Canadian institutions or culture. Now, there is a certain nihilism in this approach, and I think that settler colonial scholars do a very poor job when considering the success of Indigenous resistance through these eras of reconciliation, instead assuming that we are doomed to elimination by a genocidal state as Indigenous people. But of course, that's not true. Instead, and taking inspiration from Shiri Pasternak's work, I think that settler colonialism and Indigenous resistance are co-constitutive. That means that both processes change and shapeshift in response to one another. Indigenous people resist, Canada reacts, absorbing that resistance, reflecting it back in very minor policy shifts. This is the waxing and waning of reconciliation. Now, it would be disingenuous to say that things today are the same as they were in 1854. No, the model that I'm describing is an incremental one, an agonistic one. As settler colonialism tries to, as Lisa Ford argues, perfect territorial jurisdiction, so there is a challenge or threat from Indigenous people. Indigenous peoples sabotage that perfection. And this is the space in which we exist, in Indigenous and Canadian relations. It is the space in this conflict that is sometimes modestly productive. Despite the shape-shifting and incrementalism, every institution in Canada continues to discriminate against Indigenous people, Land dispossession continues unabated by industry and provinces, and we collectively have a decade or two before the planet decides to swallow us all. So how do we right these relations and end this particular transit of reconciliation that we've seen over and over and over again? The only real way to do so is to reflect deeply and challenge fundamentally the very institutions of this country, of our political economy, of our legal orders, and move towards an equitable sharing, a move from rights and entitlement back towards obligation and responsibility, and maybe most importantly, acknowledgement of the agency of the land. There is much to discuss on the policy side of things in this suggested reorientation back to the future. And maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer period. But the Anishinaabe have a number of prophecies that were given to us at the time of our creation, 8 of those prophecies, in fact. The keeper of the eastern door of the Midewiwin Society, Jim Dumont, says that we are in the 7th of those prophecies. Now, the earlier prophecies catalog or chronicle our migration, the arrival of newcomers, and so on. The 7th of those prophecies is when we go back on the trail, we go back on the path, and we pick up those things that were lost, or we pick up those things that were taken from us during colonization, and we use those things to fashion a future. The 8th fire is the 8th fire is the final prophecy where we get it right and we can have that relationship, that reconciliatory relationship. Oh, I'm so hesitant to use that term in the sense of right relations. Or we don't get it right. And when we don't get it right, there's tragedy and devastation for us all. So it is the hope for me, and I think many of my colleagues and my friends and family, Indigenous people who are campaigning for changes to the political relationship, that we get back to this place. We get back to these metaphors. We get back to these simple but sophisticated ways of being with each other in the world, and do so for the long term. As Chief Yellowhead once said, as long as the world stands. So Chimiigwech, thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Is that 45 minutes? Is that 45 minutes? Okay, good.
That's perfect.